And welcome back, and thank you again for being with us this morning. We are very much looking forward to our next panel discussion. We're going to talk this morning now about rural prosperity. And you know, it's getting harder and harder to be an ag producer, to live in the country. Government rules, regulations, and policies are making it more and more challenging. We're going to talk about some of these things this morning. We'll talk about rural broadband and rural crime, about the issues of urban encroachment, I guess you could say, on rural lands. And one of the things we referenced in the last panel discussion, if you were with us, the Calgary Metropolitan Region Board and urban control, the loss of local autonomy, maybe get into some of the policies that impact us in terms of carbon capture and storage and the carbon tax as ag producers. We've got a lot of ground to cover and just a little over an hour to do it. And a reminder, if you have questions, put them in the chat box and somebody will try and walk them into me. We'll do our best to get to those, but we will try and cover as much ground as we can. So let's meet our panelists this morning, and I think we'll start with those in the studio with me. Theresa Lynn is on my immediate left. Theresa is the general manager of TELUS South and Central Alberta, and somebody with strong rural roots and an agriculture background. Theresa, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to it.
Yep. So are we all. And Paul McLauchlin on the end. Paul, you're the president of the Rural Municipalities of Alberta. The Reeve, I want to say Lacombe? Ponoka, close. Lacombe Ponoka is a provincial riding. The Reeve of Ponoka, also a five-term elected member in Ponoka, and strong agricultural roots. So I know you'll bring a lot to the discussion. Thanks for making the trip down this morning.
You betcha. Excited to be here for sure.
And we've got on the phone via, or the Zoom link at least this morning with us, is Cherilyn Jolly-Nagel. And Cherilyn is a very well-known policy expert, a panelist. She is a farmer and covers a lot of ground in agriculture for sure. And I think one of Alberta's top 50 most influential people in agriculture. I hope I've got that right. Cherilyn, I want to make sure we can hear you okay. Thanks for joining us this morning.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bruce. I wouldn't put expert anywhere near my credentials, but I have opinions on lots of things, especially agriculture related. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, that's a modest start, and we appreciate the humility. But having read your bio, I think we could assign you that title in a couple of areas. In any event, we're so glad you're with us from. And is it Mossbank, Saskatchewan, Cherilyn, where your home is?
It is Mossbank. Yes, it's home of the great debate. Every little town has their own tagline. Mossbank is home of the great debate. I loved listening to Preston Manning just in your earlier session talking about all the historical debates, but he neglected to mention Mossbank's debate. So I'll follow up with him about that.
Okay, well, you got a shameless plug in this morning, and you'll have time over the next hour to get a couple of more in. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We've got a lot of ground to cover this morning, but we all have agriculture backgrounds, so I guess covering ground is a good pun to kick us off. We should be pretty good about that. Why don't we start with maybe the state of Western Canada, or certainly Alberta. I'll get to Cherilyn and find out what it's like in Saskatchewan. But Paul, I want to throw one at you. If there's anything a farmer likes to talk about, it's the weather. We don't really like to talk about it the last few months. It's been atrocious in terms of drought. What's the situation like out there right now for farmers, for ag producers?
Well, I think we need some sympathies because I think you're looking at a situation where 60% of this province was really covered with 1 in 50-year drought right now. And as that stands, it's kind of a frightening scenario. But I got to say, what a resilient bunch. I had one of the producers that I'm good friends with, and he said, well, there's always next year. I mean, that symptom of optimism, but it's been tough. There's herd dispersals going on. The ability to move goods and get goods in, feed in, has been complex. And I think one of the biggest issues was actually transportation and really the response of the government to the drought situation. The fact is that this drought is extensive. It goes all the way into Manitoba, and our friends in Manitoba have been hit way worse than we have. But in the northern United States and down to Texas, they've been hit as well. And the Americans responded by actually subsidizing transportation of feed to the point that I live in central Alberta, and feed was moving from central Alberta to Montana. And so they responded quicker to this situation where we responded late. So it's a tough time for our agricultural producers. So any support you folks can have for those folks, whether give them a handshake or say thanks for what you're doing, I think is appreciated right now.
Absolutely. Teresa, you're in the Red Deer area, correct? And
I am.
I'm assuming similar issues up there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it ripple through the other industries in the area as well. So when it hits the ag sector with the drought and the herd dispersals that were happening, you saw it impact real estate, you saw it impact car dealerships and furniture sales and, even the folks that work in media trying to sell radio and television advertising. The ripple impacts of what goes on in one sector of our economy in the central Alberta region, they translate across every possible sector. This isn't an urban and rural problem. This is a massive society problem that we had with the drought this year.
Cherilyn, set the scene for us, if you could, in Saskatchewan and kind of what your ag producers are dealing with weather-wise and what the drought has been like there, and also pick up on Paul's point, if you could, on some of the policy decisions that have been made and how they impact agriculture.
And not unlike the situation in Alberta, Saskatchewan went through the same drought scenario. There's still growers trying to bring their harvest in, and I use the term harvest loosely. It's mainly just getting some fall work done on a lot of fields that had no yield whatsoever. So just an incredibly challenging year. There isn't a farmer out there that goes into this line of work under the illusion that Mother Nature will be kind each and every year. We always get some sort of adverse weather throughout the growing season, and if it would be easy, I guess everyone would do it. So we know going into the season that there's going to be some weather challenges. This one was particularly devastating, 1 in 100 year drought scenario. And like Theresa was saying, I think that there's going to be a really long tail after this drought. The ramifications of a drought like this and the financial devastation we're going to see it for many years to come. Certainly the economy of Canada is reliant on agriculture for GDP, for jobs, for various other sectors. Our rural communities rely on their farmers in the area to do well and to support their local communities and their local provinces. So we're going to be seeing this drought, tag along with us for a number of years, and we're also trying to look ahead to next year. Like Paul was saying, there's always next year, but we are going to need, wet weather throughout the fall or through the winter time to try to make up for the lack of subsoil moisture and lack of topsoil moisture, if we don't want to experience this again next year. So we're nail biting right now to see can we make something of this next year. In terms of the policy issues, I would say they're the same policy issues that we always face, and Paul mentioned transportation. At some point, we have to get what we grow, whether it's a lot or a little, what we grow has to get to market. So we're always faced with challenges when it comes to transportation and railway transportation. In terms of the drought specifically and what can the government do, those of us that are interested in policy work are often asking that question, what is the role of government? And as someone who definitely didn't get into the agriculture industry wanting more government regulation or wanting the government involved much in any way, I don't particularly look to the government to solve these problems. There's ways that they can help, and I want them to continue to help in this capacity, whether it's a drought year or not. But I do feel it's the role of government to open up the borders. We're trying to work our way through COVID. And we've seen a lot of an increase in protectionism around the globe, where a lot of countries are looking to look inward inside their own borders and how they can sustain themselves. But Canada, we have to keep in mind, is an export nation. We are the 5th largest exporter of agriculture and agri-food products. We are a very big player when it comes to agricultural exports. So, my plea to government is to please keep trade at the top of your priority. Please ensure that the customers that we had before COVID are ready to do business with Canada, and please ensure that you're building relationships with others so that farmers who are growing something and have something to sell have a market to sell it into.
Yep, fair enough. And we'll definitely come back to the marketplace, I think, a little bit, Cherilyn, later on in the topic. I'll definitely want to come back to you for that conversation. We'll come back in studio now, though, to maybe follow up on that. Paul, did you have any thoughts on what Cherilyn had to say? And is COVID having a huge impact? Obviously, we picked this up on drought, but is COVID having an impact on producers also?
Well, I think we're dealing with this whole situation where the whole logistical chain is broken to the point that I'm hearing that tractor parts, they're talking March of 2023 for parts. So we have this very big issue related to movement of goods, logistics of goods, again, transportation, and she actually nailed it. This export conversation is fantastic. Imagine someone from Moss Bank, Saskatchewan, she's trading on the global marketplace. And that's a big message, that she's competing on that global marketplace. And we need to look at that as we look at our agriculture producers. So it's not Joe down the road, it's Joe down the road trading with the world. And I think if we have that view of our entire agricultural industry, I think it's quite important. And at the same time, you have entrepreneurs. Those folks are entrepreneurs, and they have the risks attached to entrepreneurs. And exactly that is the role of government should be to knock down barriers, to open up that path for competition, and to make sure they remain competitive on that global marketplace. And that's a bigger picture that's tied to conversations around carbon tax and all these other conversations we likely will have today. But I think that the role of government is to clear the path to ensure that they're not saber rattling, which really is going to affect agriculture producers in my county, in Moss Bank, Saskatchewan, or Northern Ontario, or rural Quebec too as well. We all have the same problem. We're competing globally. Let's deal with it that way.
Yeah, the market will do a pretty good job working things out if you let it. I mean, obviously there are flaws at times, but point taken. Over-regulation, red tape, these things are killing us, and we see it in all kinds of sectors. So good that you raise it in the ag sector. One issue we have heard a lot about I think probably, well, actually, I would say the last decade, maybe even becoming more and more, unfortunately, common, is the subject of rural crime. And I think it's because it's several factors, but maybe rural Albertans or rural Canadians in general are more susceptible to this. We're easy targets. We're not as policed. In your travels, Theresa, is this something you're hearing a lot about? And I'm going to get to some of the ways that we might be able to address it. But what are your thoughts?
Certainly rural crime is a bit of a hot button in my household lately, as we were victims of rural crime a couple of weeks ago, having a vehicle stolen from our yard at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I was up making coffee when it happened. So you immediately have this sense of vulnerability and that your trust in your community has now been shaken a bit, right? People shouldn't come into my property and steal my stuff. And there's been some increasing violence that's happened with the rural crime lately. We had the tragic incident out by Raven, Alberta recently, where the farmer's truck was being stolen. He subsequently was ran over by another vehicle operated by one of the thieves, and that's just down the road from where my husband's from, so we know the family. When you look at it, it's not just Red Deer County where I live, it's Lethbridge County, it's County of 40 Mile, it's up north, and I would say it's probably across the entire nation. There's socioeconomics that are contributing to it. There's response times that contribute to it. There's a whole bunch of things that I think we can say, as a rural residents, play into the situation that we've got. In our case, we're 40-minute response time from the nearest RCMP station. We're using technology the best we can with various apps and crime watch groups and so forth to get the messages out when there's crime that's happening in our area, but we need to get to the root cause of why it's happening and, who those repeat people are, because it seems to be the same names we see popping up in the newspaper articles. So there's a lot going on in that rural crime envelope that needs to be addressed.
Paul, I think I identified you, I hope I did, as the president of the Rural Municipalities of Alberta. I would imagine that a lot of your members are dealing with this issue. And I'll turn it over to you for some thoughts. And one of the things that we're obviously doing in these panels this morning and throughout the day, we're talking about the issue and we're talking about solutions and suggestions on how we might move forward and how we might improve some of these things. So feel free to sprinkle some of those in. If you have the great solution, that would be wonderful. But I'm sure some of your members are discussing strategies in dealing with it.
Yeah, and definitely, it's one of our number one topics, obviously, and as was said, we are sitting ducks in many ways, and we're sitting ducks in as much as access to enforcement is difficult, but really, when you really get back to it, the political answer is let's get more police. But you can have 2 police that are 30 minutes from me is the same as 1 police that's 30 minutes from me. And so it's really judicial reform is the conversation. It's this revolving door. We really need to spend a lot of energy on that. And then the long game. And the long game is tied to wraparound, dealing with poverty, exactly the socioeconomic, dealing with substance abuse, providing those pieces in place, and early intervention is important. And it's funny, I talked to Minister Bill Baird. He was talking about handguns, and he was talking about handgun banning and all these pieces. And I said, wait a minute, I'd rather spend my energy talking about preschool, early intervention. I want to talk about catching kids and giving them hope and getting them out of poverty, and that's the long game. The political answer to crime is handgun conversation. The social answer to crime is those wraparound conversations, and a stronger judicial system, I think, is the big one. This revolving door is horrific, and we've seen that in recent cases. And sadly, the fatalities or the murders that occurred in Hinton, that is a symbol of what's wrong with the system. Let's spend our energy on judicial reform and play the long game on early intervention.
Yeah, and just so making sure we're on the same page. I think we are. When you talk about the revolving door, you're talking about the catch and release system that is the justice system. And of course, Cherilyn, I think I saw you nodding there at one point. What are your thoughts, and how are things maybe different in your neck of the woods there in Mossbank?
Well, they're not much different. No question, we've seen an increase in rural crime. And I guess for where we've had a truck stolen or some pretty minor things, fuel stolen, things like that. And I think for me, the biggest issue, because we're raising kids out here on the farm too, is this sentiment of not feeling safe. And as somebody who grew up on the farm and who's encouraging people to consider agriculture as a future career, it's kind of challenging to think that feeling safe in your childhood and as a parent may not always be part of the agriculture industry or living on the farm. So I certainly look at it from a parenting lens.
What do you tell? Just curious. What do you tell your kids on the farm? I mean, you got a strange vehicle in the area. These kinds of things. I mean, what can you do to protect yourselves? Or is it something you and your neighbors talk about in general that you kind of keep an eye out for each other?
Yes, absolutely. We're often talking, and it's part of living rurally is that you want your neighbors to be able to come in and jump in the truck or come in and open up a shop and borrow a tool if they need to. And so when you have kids, you really do have to have a lot of conversations around that. We also struggle, and I know we're going to get to it, but we struggle with cell phone service and cell coverage and things like that. And I was that parent that didn't particularly want my kids to get a cell phone. But that was one of the rationale for getting the kids a cell phone was the issues around rural crime and can our kids get in touch with somebody if they need to, if somebody, a suspect, was coming into the yard. I maybe jest a little bit, but I think my father-in-law drives around each and every morning and each and every night, so he's kind of like our rural crime watch guy. He might see what's happening before anybody else. But we definitely keep an eye out for each other.
You need them. You need people like your father-in-law, don't you? For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, you raised the issue of rural broadband and cell phone service. It'd be tough to find a better, more qualified individual to speak to it than Theresa Lynn, who's in studio with us today, and General Manager TELUS, I think, South and Central Alberta.
Yep.
Huge issue. We hear about it here. I know I've read a lot of headlines locally, Rocky View County. I was watching many of their council meetings online because they had to go online, and councillors, depending on where they were often, their service was intermittent, breaking up, and it was distracting, and there are safety issues around this too. I mean, how big is the issue? Maybe give us some context on what you see.
So if you look at the context and the size of the problem across rural Canada, it is about 14% of Canadians don't have access to reasonable broadband. So 50-10, if we want to use the government's line in the sand, 50-10. 14%. It is roughly a $6 to $10 billion problem, depending on the technology you want to use and depending on who's assessing the numbers, but you're probably in that vicinity. So you need somewhere between 6 and 10 billion to cover off 14% of the population. I would say when we look closer to Alberta, we're doing better than some of the other areas in certain pockets, but there is a significant amount of this province that needs more, and it needs industry, it needs government, it needs regulatory, it needs policy. Like, it is a massive basket.
So you're giving us Alberta numbers, and of course we get, it's probably similar in other provinces. But are you talking, when you talk $6 to $10 billion, is that the amount of money that we need on infrastructure to put up the towers, et cetera, and everything that we will need so that we can have service in all these rural areas?
Yeah, if you unlocked somewhere between 6 and 10 billion, both from industry and government, you would solve the rural connectivity problem from coast to coast to coast.
Well, we can get 10% of that from an election we just had that we didn't need. Paul, where does the sorry, that was my inside voice speaking out loud, but where
Zing! That's one for you, Bruce.
that's right, thank you, Cherilyn. Where does the money come from? I mean, is this the kind of thing that you hear from your members as well?
You know, it's surprising they think President of the Rural Municipalities of Alberta, I talk about agriculture, I talk about broadband. This is a day 167 broadband conversation. And so what they're looking at is, and I love the word that I heard actually, we were speaking about the rural-urban divide, and which is a big discussion that goes beyond this conversation. But it's really looking at it as an enabling investment. And I think that we really need to view this as the ultimate form of economic development. And so, but what you need to understand is a density conversation. Rural Canada has a low density, high need. But I'll use examples from the province of Alberta. So we represent 18% of the population in the province of Alberta. We contribute 24% to the GDP of the province, 41% of the capital investments in rural Alberta. And so by extension, though, our density is so low that we need to start looking at bridging that. So I do think you need a combination of investment, government investment, but you also need to be enabling to have that private investment. And I think it's speaking to the areas that are the low-hanging fruit have been taken care of, the business cases there. We need to deal with the underserved and the unserved. Mm-hmm. And when you start bridging that, you start building this enabling situation that you have the education, you have prosperity, you have investment. People move into Ponoka County, they don't ask how great the REIV is, they don't ask how low the taxes are, they want to know what broadband's available to them. That is the number one question we get at our office at Ponoka County. So that shift has occurred. It's an investment that really pays back, and it will improve our GDP. And I have seen the good folks of rural Quebec are seeing provincial investments right now that are paying off in spades. We've tested our members in rural Alberta. 9% have 50-10 in the province of Alberta right now, 9%. And the federal government's using statistics that say 32%. So we are so far behind, we have a lot to catch up on.
I'll just add, I think they know how great the REIV is. You've been 5 terms up there. You should be far grayer, by the way, five terms in public office. Cherilyn, Saskatchewan, you raised the subject, so maybe a little bit more to it. I don't expect you to have the numbers in terms of the infrastructure deficit that is required to fix it, but I would like maybe a little bit more on how you see the issues in your province.
Yep, we absolutely are suffering from issues with lack of broadband, lack of cell phone coverage and internet. I've written a couple of pieces about this topic because I felt like maybe we were not being clear in our understanding of what it really means for a farmer to have better internet service. And oftentimes, you know, my counterattack is it's just not about Netflix. You know, a lot of the assumptions of the people I speak with when I try to complain about the fact that we have such poor broadband at times, you know, where they're having a conversation about Game of Thrones, which is a commitment that this rural farmer could never attempt to partake in. We do not have that kind of Netflix capacity out here. However, the data collection that is required on modern agricultural farms today is not being utilized to the best of its potential. We have enormous amounts of data that we have to collect. whether that's from weather stations or from our GPS, from our equipment, to our variable rate application. All of that has to be uploaded, and then we have to be able to utilize that data. And all of that requires better broadband. You know, we also, on a day-to-day operation, our farm crew, we have a WhatsApp chat. We used to have the old CB radios, and we still have to have those at every piece of equipment because there are large chunks of land on our operation that have no cell phone coverage. So there's safety issues around that, and there's just pure inconvenience when you are trying to manage a farm operation in the middle of, whether it's seeding or spraying or harvest. Not being able to be in contact with the rest of your crew is really challenging.
Yep, 100%. And I'm just stuck on the fact that, you know, what level of government comes up with the infrastructure dollars to fix it. And frankly, it may be a combination of three of them. It may be federal, provincial, and municipal. But it seems like whichever one you go to points the finger at the other guy, and that can be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, Bruce, just a comment about that. I remember the Prime Minister making a grandiose statement about, you know, 98% of the population shall have high-speed internet by such and such a date. And I thought, you know, some real quick bar napkin math, 2% of the population in Canada is rural. So if 98% are guaranteed high-speed internet, there's a really good chance that 2% is still us left without the broadband capacity that we require.
Yeah, I think there'd be a few statements that we might question that we've heard of late coming out of Ottawa, Cherilyn. So thank you. Let's shift gears a little bit now. Paul, I want to start with you on this topic, and I want to set it up a bit for those that may not be aware of it. We've been talking about rural autonomy and rural municipalities losing the ability to make decisions on what happens on their lands to their urban neighbors. There's a board in Calgary called the Calgary Metropolitan Region Board, and it is basically made up of 10 municipalities in the Calgary region, and it was devised with the intent of sound regional planning. What it is a backdoor to giving veto control of the region to Calgary and the big urbans, and effectively making it tough for rural municipalities to compete. Did I set that up okay? And maybe tell us a little bit more about it and some of your concerns.
No, well, I think you nailed it. I think you captured a very complex topic, and you put it into a nice small little bucket. So, you know, core principles, who can speak against planning? Regional planning, and I think that when you really look at it overall, I think rural municipalities and that autonomy is so important. We've just came through a federal election. Local decision making is the boots on the ground. It's probably the most perfect form of government, in as much as the accountability is huge. I get accountability at the feed store. I get accountability when I go into town. I get accountability when I'm at a gas station. So it's really the ultimate form. What the problem with this conversation is, when you centralize decision making, and really what you have at the CMRB, you have asymmetric veto power, where you do have a situation where the cities are making decisions on behalf of the rurals, and if you had the reverse, you sure don't want the rurals telling the city of Calgary how to run things. And so when you have this asymmetric voting power, you have a situation where you will not have prosperity. You have red tape. We need to build certainty. We need to have investment. We need to foster investment. In order to do so, we need to release the shackles and provide that local decision making that is on behalf of the communities, and take off those other decision models that go away. Because the fact is this asymmetric decision making is pushing investment out of this region.
Yeah, if I had a table at the legislature and I could bang it and say here, I would to your response. I'm going to stay with you on this for one more answer or question. In Rocky View, for instance, there have been developments that have been pitched and brought forward, worked with the municipality to approve, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent. The community is on side and said, yes, we want this, only to have them vetoed at the Calgary Metropolitan Region Board, which frankly is stifling competition. It's like Ford telling GM what they can and can't do, while they continue to develop the products in the same way that they would if they were the rurals. I guess I put it like this: if there's a piece of dirt here and it's owned by the rural and they have a great plan for it and they want to do something, the urban can say no. But if they annex that land or amalgamated it, they would have shovels in the ground tomorrow. Something about that seems drastically wrong in Alberta.
Yeah, it's exactly like Ottawa deciding what should go in Alberta, right? So why would you create a model that we're upset about? We just came through a federal election. We're concerned. We're thinking Ottawa is telling us what to do. Why would you create models within the province of Alberta that is exactly that situation, where someone else is making decisions on behalf of your community, and again, they've got the power and authority that they shouldn't have. And I'm not saying not to work with your partners on good planning, long-term planning, but at the same time, we need agility in our system. And in order to have agility, when you start layering down to the local governments, you have tremendous agility. We can respond quite quickly when you have the community on side. That's 90% of every project is communities on side and your local governments on side. It really should be a clear path, and investment should follow that path.
Yeah, thank you. For context, to those of you watching and hopefully enjoying the conversation this morning, this was initially mandated, well, it was mandated by the New Democratic Party, by Rachel Notley's government, and the UCP has failed to address it and deal with it, as most rural municipalities in the region are suggesting that they do. So it'll be interesting to see what they do going forward. Cherilyn, you're all about policy, and I don't know that Saskatchewan would have anything like this in place. I can't imagine it, frankly. Are you familiar with what we're talking about, and what kind of alarm bells go off when you hear us discussing it?
Yeah, it's certainly a situation that I would like highlighted and talked more about. It seems like a very extreme case, but there's a lot of other nuanced issues between rural and urban. I would get the pesticide application as one of them, where you have a lot of urban centers that include rural municipalities in the area, and when they come up with regulations around pesticide application or no pesticide application, that has tremendous effect on the agriculture and the rural communities that are surrounding that. So always we are in a position where agriculture, if I can take some onus in this, we need to do a better job of building relationships with the urban governance so that we can have a place to tell our story and share our side of the story. I'm a very strong advocate of farmers taking part in governance, and whether that looks like participating on your local boards. Maybe it's so much as volunteer boards within urban centers. Maybe it is a political aspiration that they have for governance, or maybe it's just just learning a bit more about governance models that will affect us. Now, a number of years ago, I got my corporate director certification, and having that kind of experience and that designation allows me to sit on boards that may seem totally irrelevant to agriculture, but I get to share the lens of a farmer on boards that don't have that perspective. So I'm always encouraging other farmers to get involved in governance, whether it's at a very basic level or whether it's something that they can look at doing in the off season or after retirement. I think one of the everybody's talking about diversity on boards, and I like to include farmer in that diversity because I think we offer a really unique perspective given society's lens on food and in the environment today.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate point, Cherilyn, and I'm glad that you're out there advocating for the farmer and the agriculture community. Before I wrap this subject, I just want to give Theresa a chance to weigh in on it. I know it's not your bailiwick or your area of expertise, but being in Red Deer, very few people have driven through Red Deer and not stopped at Gasoline Alley in Red Deer County, and obviously they've had the ability to develop and to put amenities, frankly, where people want them, and they probably have a pretty good tax base because of it. I mean, is this an issue that resonates with you?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. So whether it's Red Deer County or any of the other counties that surround those urban areas that I live, work, or serve, Rocky View County is an area I know really well. I do a lot of work down there with them. This is a significant issue. The best way to get stuff done, whether it's telecommunications or broadband, from my lens, from a economic investment standpoint, is at the local level with the local municipality. The less layers we have of interference and political red tape and roadblocks, the faster we can put investment in to solve infrastructure issues like what Cherilyn was talking about. We need the cell phone coverage out on the farm. We need the technology in our small hamlets and villages across this country so that those folks can educate, recreate, healthcare, businesses, like all of it. We should not have a digital divide in this country in 2021. It is absolutely mind-blowing that that hasn't been resolved.
All right, thank you. I'm glad we went to you. I should mention, as we wrap this topic, there is a report that was just released. It was done by Peter McCaffrey. It's entitled Opportunity or Threat, and it looks at the issue of the Calgary Metropolitan Region Board, the history of regional planning in the area, and frankly, the anti-competitive, unnecessary fourth layer of government that it is. And to Paul's points, explains why this is something that the UCP government needs to address. So if you're interested, I'm sure a quick Google will find you that. So many things to talk about, I guess, from a rural-urban perspective. Here's one that'll get us all interested, and I want Cherilyn to kick us off. The subject of urban-rural divide. You speak many different places about this and talk to audiences about it. Is it a very real problem today? Is it getting worse? And frankly, how do we deal with it?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, Bruce. Thanks for bringing this up. I pre-COVID was spending more time away from the farm than I was on the farm, speaking to who I refer to as our urban cousins about the modern agricultural tools we use on the farm today. And, from my journey has gone from, one of defense. I have so many terrible memories of being online on social media and on Facebook in all capital letters, trying desperately to fight with people online and share the truth about what we do on the farm when it comes to pesticide applications or GMOs or all these scary things that people fear when they think of agriculture and food. And the pendulum has swung to the other side, and I'm now much more relaxed and calm about it, and I thoroughly enjoy the conversation. And I think that journey is because I now take responsibility and ownership for where we are today. Most Canadians are now 2 generations removed from the family farm. So they don't have a connection to a farm, and they haven't been part of the story where we've gone from tractors. You guys had a great commercial just prior to us. It was from Second Street Org, and they were sharing the story about the use of tractors and how we used to, plow with a horse and buggy, and where we've gone to today using GPS equipment and automation. And so I would argue that agriculture is one of the most scientifically advanced industries on the globe, but the perception that consumers have of the industry is still, that the farmer in the dell, the old McDonald's that's got the pitchfork and the coveralls, and not at all how I appear today. And we have to take some ownership in that, because farmers, we just kind of got out of our tractor one day and went, oh man, nobody trusts us. Nobody's asking us about what we do to grow food, and we didn't know that we had to be part of this conversation. Generations of my family have been farming, but my generation is the only one that's had to consider having conversations with consumers. I've never asked my grandpa whether or not he's updated his blog on the drought this year. There was never such a thing as have consumer conversations about what we do on the farm. We're typically a private people. One of my friends says most people go into farming because they don't even like people. They like to be social distanced anyways. So the idea that we have to feel compelled as farmers to talk about what we do is challenging. But I thoroughly enjoy it, and I've come to realize that for the most part, the questions and the concerns and the fears that consumers have are very easily answered. There's tough questions about how to explain, a very scientific method of genetic modification in canola seed. And then there's just some really high level questions about why we love to farm and why we do what we do. So I'm enjoying the conversation, and I'm open and willing to have as many conversations with consumers as I can. And I spend my time on stage to large audiences, whether it's an audience of chiropractors or an audience of teachers, just giving them the basics of how we got to what they used to think was agriculture to the farm that my family has today.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there's a lot there. Thank you. What a great answer. It gives us a lot to play off. Frankly, I think I fit into one of those categories that you mentioned there. Raised on a farm, a small cow-calf operation, but my kids, other than a visit to Grandpa's house, have no understanding because they haven't been. And so with that generation, that farm will, some of that knowledge will be lost. I wonder if it's almost out of sight, out of mind, Paul, for many people. They're not there, they don't have the experience. Maybe that's part of the divide.
I think it is, and I think it's interesting, and we need champions like Cherilyn. I mean, the fact is that I looked at a post-election analysis, and in fact, and I know your prior conversation, the prior conversation was about East versus West,
Yep.
And in fact, actually, if you actually look at what the way the polling turned out, it was actually urban versus rural. And if you actually look at that conversation, we have just as much in common as rural Quebecers as we do with downtown Toronto folks. So really, we've got this divide, and it exists. And I remember, there's no rural divide. There is a rural-urban divide, and exactly it's that disconnect. If there's one thing this COVID world has taught us, is food sovereignty should be our #1 priority. Energy sovereignty. Look what's going on in the UK right now. The fact is, we have energy sovereignty. We have a lot in our place, and we need to support our agricultural and rural communities in as much as that. The one thing that's happening too is a shift in Alberta is what COVID has done was there's a rural exodus now, and that's not people leaving rural, there's an urban exodus to rural, and we are seeing a tremendous increase in development permits. Folks are going, wait a minute, I need to change, I don't like living in the city, and people are moving out, and they're moving out to the rural parts, and that's exciting to me because I think that the bridge is there. But we need to be champions, we need to tell people what we do that's amazing. Speaking earlier, as she said, we are an exporter, a net exporter of food. We are producing goods that go throughout the world, and we need to prosper and honor that and respect that. 9% of our GDP is our agricultural industry, and it can be 15-20% if we invest in the right place. And we need to support our rural folks to do that. In order to do that, we need to educate, we need champions, and we need to make sure that our policy decisions isn't stifling those opportunities, but it's encouraging them. And the one final point I'll give you is that we need to actually look at rural Canada as an opportunity for innovation. We hear so many people talking about Silicon Valley, and I need to create an app. Wait a minute, shift your gears and look at the problems that agriculture has to deal with, and the innovation that can be created by those young minds that are looking at tech and looking at the future. There's fantastic problems that need real solutions, and those folks can provide those to rural Canada.
100%. And to Cherilyn's point, I mean, you sit in a tractor today, it's not your old Massey Harris. I'm curious to one of the things you raised about a lot of people moving to the country now. Is it a stereotypical person? Is it all kinds of different people? And are they looking to grow their own food? I mean, is it just get out of the city? I'm curious to this.
I'm seeing, we've actually provided more $1 million home development permits than we ever have. But I'm also seeing exactly that. People that want to be self-reliant, that they want to make sure that they're no longer a victim of the world, but have a bit more control of the world. Because if there's one thing that actually, that really makes us different than every other province, is that we have a lot more self-reliance in Alberta than other places. And you learn that by the dialogues I have with other politicians. Like when they say Albertans are entrepreneurial, we are entrepreneurial. Rural Canada are entrepreneurial. We are self-reliant. COVID was a different conversation with my family on the farm than it was that my urban friends that were worried about taking their dog for a walk.
Yep.
Completely different conversation. I was self-reliant, and I had to watch my chickens because I think they're a hot commodity to get stolen. The fact that I had fresh eggs every day and I have a freezer full of meat, and we were able to take care of ourselves. And I think people have learned that, and they don't want to be reliant on external forces to feed their family and to take care of themselves.
Theresa, you've been nodding along quite a bit with what Paul has said, and even with Cherilyn. So obviously it's resonating with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was growing up, I grew up in northern rural Saskatchewan, and in order to go and do something in life, to go away and get an education, you had to move. To get a good job, you had to move. So unless you wanted to stay home and live and work in that community, in order to economically propel yourself forward, you had to relocate. That's not the case anymore. Right. If you look at Drumheller or you look at McGrath down south, these are communities now where you can get a Master's of Computer Science and Cybersecurity from MIT without leaving your house. You can now get those jobs that pay 6 figures and then some. It's changing the face of rural Canada, because you get the high income professionals now that want all of those wonderful lifestyle pieces that rural Canada gives and rural Alberta gives. But I want to be connected. I want to be able to be an architect or an engineer or a cybersecurity person. And no longer do we have these stigmas of you have to be in Calgary or Vancouver or Toronto. And you think you can go to Drumheller today. There's a listing on their real estate site. You can buy a house in Drumheller for $100,000. You can't buy a cardboard box in some of our urban markets for $100,000. But you have to get the infrastructure there in order to make all of that work, right? I was just down in McGrath. There is a frame company down there, largest supplier of oval frames in the world. They do 275,000 frames a year. Their clients, Disney, celebrities, royals. And this is a company that is based out of a small agriculture village in the middle of, rural Alberta that had all of the things set up right to be successful there. And now they raise their families there, and this business is hugely successful. That should happen all across Canada, because it really is the best place to live. We're all rural folks. We're clearly champions.
Yeah, and we're clearly a little bit biased. But,
a little bit biased.
But I'll take your point. And I think most of us, or the three of us in studio, have mentioned rural Alberta several times. But obviously it applies to rural Saskatchewan and rural Canada. And Cherilyn, I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face also this morning. And one of them, I guess, concerning some of the policies that we have to deal with as ag producers. Here's, and I don't want to just raise this for a chance for us to sound off, but something like the carbon tax that impacts farmers and ranchers and ag producers so much more than people realize. Can you give us some context as to the difference that makes on your operation, for instance, and maybe some suggestions on how governments might handle these things a little bit better?
Yeah, no question. We consider it the C word around here to talk about carbon tax. And I talk about this with my kids all the time around the table, because there's a lot of pressure on the next generation to be thinking about the environment. And they feel pressure. They're trying to understand what it means. And so when my kids come home from school and they have questions about our farming practices, and are we polluting the environment? This is what the textbooks say. This is what the curriculum is about. This is what I hear on the news. That is a perfect opportunity for us to have a great conversation about the modern agricultural practices we use, and also really negative impacts coming from government policy. And I would say if there is something that's keeping me up at night, there's a lot of things keeping me up at night, but carbon tax is at the very top of the list. There's so many misconceptions around the agricultural emissions, and it's been challenging for us to tell that story for all the reasons I just said before. We didn't tell the public about all of the technological advances that our farm was adopting. We didn't know we had to. I've had a great conversation with my dad a number of years ago about his first experience with no-till technology in terms of a seeding operation. So we went from plowing through the land, tilling up the ground, drying it out, killing the weeds in that capacity, to no-till, meaning that we no longer disturb the soil. This has been the single most significant environmentally friendly farming practice that has happened in his generation and so far in mine. And we didn't tell anybody about it. There's a great documentary online, several of them, about the Dust Bowl. And from you've seen the pictures of the dust bowls that used to roll through. The wind is still an issue in Alberta. It's still an issue in Saskatchewan, and yet it's such a great visual for us to showcase the new farming practices that we have today, like no-till. If you get 100-kilometer-an-hour wind out here, oftentimes you don't see the topsoil blowing anymore. And I would have to argue that if farmers in the industry had gone to the trouble to tell the story of each step of the technological advances that we were adopting on our own, I might add, there was no government subsidy for my dad when he invested in the new expensive equipment that was coming out to adopt it. He did it because it made sense for the land. And that's exactly the same parameters that my farm operation uses when we make decisions. Does it make good sense for the land? Not, is the government going to reimburse me for it? So what happened with the carbon tax, I believe, was there was an impression that agriculture was still a culprit in affecting the environment to the emissions. And we didn't tell anybody about all the sequestration of carbon that was happening under the soil. So now I feel like there's this complete misnomer and all of these myths around agriculture and what we've done to the environment, that we're faced with a carbon tax that will absolutely cripple us as farmers in Canada. Our earlier discussion talked about how we need to compete on a world stage, but my competitors don't have that carbon tax. Farmers in Australia that I compete with, farmers directly across the US border that I compete with, don't have a carbon tax. And all of that carbon tax in some form will filter down to the farmers. You can tax the railways for the carbon emissions. That will come to me because of the freight costs. You can tax the fertilizer companies. You can tax all of them for producing fertilizer. I buy the fertilizer that I need to grow the food. I will receive that carbon tax. And I don't have anybody I can pass that on to. So my message to political affiliates with carbon tax and to the public is that the carbon tax will absolutely cripple the agriculture industry. And we need to reconsider how we address our environmental behaviors. It will not in any way make the agriculture industry more environmentally friendly. That was a big rant.
It was, but it was very passionate and frankly very educated, and you laid out the case for what farmers and ranchers are dealing with, and that's what I asked you to do. So thank you for that. And I'm going to ask Paul and Theresa to weigh in on this subject. I know that you hear a lot about it. Theresa, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, so carbon tax and subsequently policy that's brought down, it will harm the farmers, it will harm the ag sector, it will harm small towns and rural communities because it's driving that excess cost in. My business, no different. We have policy above us that absolutely will ripple through and cause harm to the agriculture communities that we're trying to solve. Our biggest battle is spectrum and inefficient spectrum policy in Canada. So, right now, if you think of the spectrum that's been deployed, the set-asides that happen in that effort to get lower cost of technology out so that operations like Cherilyn's can use those technology-equipped machinery, 85% of that set-aside spectrum that was purchased sits unused, not deployed. If you put that in the hands of somebody that actually is going to deploy it, we could literally solve the connection problem in Alberta in the next 2 years, and without a significant price tag. So, we have policy on spectrum that drives us crazy. We have, the red tape to get investment through the various levels of government. You mentioned some boards earlier where you wind up with excess red tape. All of that, Cherilyn, you're absolutely right? Everything that we do, we're getting nailed on a tax or a red tape or a policy that works against rural Alberta and rural Canada, works against us getting that investment in there on every single front, whether it's ag, whether it's tech, whether it's industry of any sort.
I think Cherilyn thank you. I think Cherilyn raised some good points about how we communicate that and how we tell a different story, Paul. And because it's one thing to rant about how it's impacting us, it's another to go ahead and quantify it, to point it out, and to explain how we're not at a level playing field with our competitors. These are things that you hear and see a lot of, I'm assuming.
Lots, and I just so happen to be an environmental scientist. So, and Cherilyn, awesome rant. And I'll tell you, and I'm a professional biologist and have been so for 27 years. I work in the field. I'm an expert in microgeneration. I work on oil and gas. I work on coal mines. So even though I'm an elected official, I actually happen to be a scientist too. Simple conversation that's tied to this is you're using an economic instrument to change people's behavior. At the same time, and to Cherilyn's point, you have someone's behavior that is providing a net balance positive positive benefit to all Canadians, that being the ecosystem goods and services the agricultural community provides in the form of biodiversity, carbon sequestration, as at the same time food. So when you layer this economic instrument that's used to change behavior and creating an uncompetitive commodity, you cause two things. You're getting rid of cash flow, which is to pay for the real cool things that you want to do that sound really awesome by putting solar panels on schools or whatever you're doing. At the same time, you're stifling that cash flow we need to actually be adaptive to climate change. The conversation needs to shift from this change behavior to an adaptation conversation. I've given presentations on climate change in multiple venues, and I always say, you're welcome. I've been sequestering carbon on my farm. No one's giving me credit for it. Maybe I should start actually asking about it. And to Cherilyn's point, we've been doing so. And I think we need to shift that conversation to actually looking at adaptation, looking at the ecosystem goods and services and the nature-based solution that our agricultural and rural Canadians provide the rest of Canada, and shifting that conversation to that discussion. And it is quantifiable, and I could spend 4 hours. I'm looking at the 10-minute clock here that I can't do so. So the question I have for this is that if you're using something to try to change behavior, you should go the other direction, and you should actually reward good behavior, which I do believe rural Canadians are providing. So I think that we need to look at it in that context, and that'll change the conversation. The other problem that I have is that we need to be competitive. We need to feed this world, and if you make our commodities uncompetitive, we cannot feed this world. And this world needs our food. They need our pulses, they need our peas, they need our protein. We can do it, but we can't do it when we have this layering on top of it of this carbon tax conversation. And I try to keep it for under 2 minutes, so sorry, Bruce.
You did well, and you know what? Cherilyn did so well kicking it off. I'm just going to go back to her one more time and let you bookend it. I mean, after hearing from Theresa and Paul, Cherilyn, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, well, for me, again, it comes down to telling a story back to Canadians. The Canadian consumers are having an influence in the policies that come out of government. And because we have such a disconnect between rural and urban, it's going to take an enormous amount of effort on our part in the industry to educate and to share what is truly happening. And I believe that they are open to it. It's rare that I have a conversation with my urban cousins and they don't better understand my perspective at the end because they just simply didn't have enough information. Oftentimes, they want to help us and they believe that taxing those big bad fertilizer companies and those big bad fuel companies is somehow going to help the farmer. You know, when they hear the government talk about 30% fertilizer reduction, isn't that going to help the environment? So I have to share with them what that's actually going to mean. You know, reducing fertilizer consumption for farmers will mean a drastic reduction in what we can produce, which has the effect of higher food prices. And the Center for Food Integrity does a fantastic job of consumer research. And the number one concern for consumers today is the rising cost of food. So we have to piece together for them that a policy like a carbon tax or a policy like 30% fertilizer reduction will equal higher cost of food. And can we piece that story together for them? It's really about building back the trust that agriculture has lost. I would be remiss to not talk about some of the mistakes that agriculture has made in the past. So I understand why we're not always trusted. We've made some mistakes in the past and we're learning from them, and we need our public to allow us to do better. When we know better, we do better, and farmers are always trying to adopt new and better ways of doing things. This land has been in our family for more than 100 years. Every generation of farmer before me in my family has considered we have to make better decisions. And my kids complain because we made them plant 2,000 trees this summer because we believe every generation has to plant trees on your farm. And we don't do that because the government has told us to do that. We don't do it because our urban population has wagged a finger at agriculture and you must do better. We do it because we have always done it. Mm-hmm. And my challenge and the agriculture industry's challenge, rural Canadians' challenge, is to better share our story in order to gain trust from Canadians that are making some really critical decisions today.
If I could book you for a speaker, Cherilyn, I think I'd do that. You seem to have some experience at it, and you're making some great points this morning. I want to ask you, and ask you to be a bit more brief. We're winding down on time, but there's a misconception out there that, oh, the price of beef is really high, farmers must be, or ranchers must really be raking it in. Oh, food prices have gone up, farmers must be making a ton. Except that's not how it works, is it?
It truly isn't. And brevity is not my strong suit. So if you book me, book me a longer time frame. But it truly isn't how it works. We really don't have the opportunity to sell direct to consumers, which is how you generate that margin. Everything grown on my farm operation is typically destined for the export market in some sort of bulk commodity fashion. We are getting a little better in Canada at adding value. You would have heard recent announcements of canola processing here in Saskatchewan. So that's one step closer to us getting better at adding value to the bulk commodities. But it's very rare that a farmer is able to capture any sort of higher margin as the food prices fluctuate.
Thank you. We needed to address that point. We've tried to address as many as we can. We've got time for some concluding comments from each of you. I'd like to start maybe, Theresa, with yourself. We talked about broadband. That's a sweet spot for you and something you'd like to see improved upon. Talking about rural prosperity, what do you think needs to change?
I think if we want to truly get parity between urban and rural, and we want to close that divide, we need to get the infrastructure out there. And I would plead with the people making decisions in the province in Ottawa to do a few things to enable that. Streamline the funding, because the business case in rural Canada isn't cost effective for industry to do it alone. Of that $6 to $10 billion, industry will probably contribute $4 billion. We got to close the gap. We need the policies to change to allow us to layer all of the funding together and make it easy and seamless to stack all the opportunity at once, whether it's funding from the province, funding from industry, and funding from the feds or other sources to get this out there. And lastly, I would plead with the decision makers, the policy makers, to understand that we can get the outcome we need regardless of the tech that we use to get there, whether it's wireless, wireline like fiber optics or copper, or low Earth orbit satellite like Starlink. There is a solution to solve this problem, but we need to get the policy in place to allow industry to work with the municipalities, work with the communities from coast to coast to coast to actually get it done. And right now, the red tape that we have and the ineffective policy actually will stop. It will not allow us to hit that 2025 broadband goal. It's almost impossible if money doesn't flow.
Thank you. Paul, concluding thoughts on rural prosperity and some of the things we've discussed.
There is so much opportunity that can be harnessed in rural Canada. And I think that we need to view it as the fact that this is where our food, our water, our air, our energy comes from. And in order to prosper as rural Canadians, we need to be open to innovation. We need to eliminate the red tape, decentralization of government, everything we talked about here. Our greatest resource is our rural people. And we need to give them the room to move. We need to make sure that these long-term farms have the opportunity to get to market, get their food to market, look at innovation, value add. I think there's tremendous opportunity in energy in rural Canada. And I think in order to prosper, we need to realize that go local, think global. And if we can actually look in that context and bridge that gap and actually take on the world competitively, but take care of ourselves, I think we can be there. And I'm excited by the amazing people that I deal with and I represent both politically as well as my neighbors. And we can get there. But you got to clear the path and we got to be able to get out of my way and we can do this. And I think there's so much opportunity we haven't tapped yet. We need to do so. And in order to be successful, we need to both be successful and we need to bridge that urban-rural divide and we need to do it together for sure.
Well, and a tip of the cap to you, Paul. I know some of the work you do as the president of the Rural Municipalities of Alberta. I've been running in the same circles on some of the same issues and you've been a strong advocate for rural Albertans out there. And good luck in addressing the Calgary Metropolitan Region Board, some of these other inequities. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being here today. Cherilyn, I've left you the last word, and I've saved you a little more time than everybody else. How about that? Just about 2 minutes. So what are your concluding thoughts on rural prosperity and some of the things that we as a nation need to do better?
Yeah, I love to get the last word. I'll let my husband know that he's off the hook today. I guess I'd like to leave it with a call to action. I'm really excited because I feel like the call to action has changed. When I first started my farming career 25 years ago, the call to action for farmers was have some pride in what you do. You know, that we were very humble people. We had no pride. Saskatchewan in particular had no pride for our province. The graduation gift, the most popular graduation gift in 1997 when I graduated was luggage, because everybody was leaving. And the call to action to the industry was have some pride in what you do. And I think we've really accomplished that. You would be hard pressed to meet a farmer, especially a young farmer, that isn't super pumped about the industry and all of the advances and the cool stuff. All the cool kids are farmers today. We're excited. But the new call to action is the obligation to tell our story, to have as many conversations as we can about what we do and how we do it on the farm. And that's all kinds of spectrums. Maybe it's online where our young people want to be. If you have, you know, skills and the desire to be online, share the agriculture story online. If that's too much, if you're more like me and you want to interact with an audience, share your story on a public stage. Or maybe it's a matter of going into your school or your rink and having conversations with people and answering their questions. Maybe you have Aunt Muriel in Vancouver who can't believe that your farm, you know, is still spraying pesticides. And maybe that's the conversation you need to have. But everybody, the new call to action is that you have to start talking about what you're doing on the farm and how you're doing it, because it's a good news story and we have to share it.
Wonderful. Great stuff, and it's a perfect place to leave it. Cherilyn, thank you. Thank you for being with us this morning. It's been a real treat to have you.
My pleasure. Thanks to everyone in studio as well.
You bet. And we'll thank Theresa and Paul also. And an hour plus just flies by, doesn't it, when you're talking about something so important to most of us. Rural prosperity, thank you for watching.